Right now, as you're watching this, China is making more money from the war in the Middle East than any country that's actually fighting in it. Not through weapons sales, not through secret alliances, not through anything that would show up in a headline, through something quieter, colder, and far more calculated than any of that. And once you see exactly how the mechanism works, you will never look at a conflict zone the same way again. But before we get to China, we need to talk about a factory owner in Guangdong province in early 2026. He's been running his manufacturing plant at a loss for nearly 2 years. His electricity costs are bleeding him. His raw material suppliers are struggling. His German competitors have just announced price increases of 30% across their entire product line. He's been watching his margins collapse month after month with no floor in sight. And then quietly, without any announcement, without any explanation, his energy costs drop. His input costs drop. This month, for the first time in almost 2 years, his factory turns a profit. He doesn't fully understand why. He just knows something shifted. What shifted was a war 3,000 miles away that he has no connection to whatsoever. And the country that engineered that shift never fired a single bullet to make it happen. To understand how this works, not just the surface of it, but the actual architecture of it, we need to go back to 1848. To a piece of California dirt and one of the most ruthless business moves in American history. The gold was discovered in January of that year. A man named James Marshall found traces of it in the American River, and word began to spread. Slowly at first, then like a fire that finds wind. Farmers left their crops in the ground. Lawyers abandoned their offices. Carpenters walked off job sites mid-construction. Hundreds of thousands of human beings from across America and eventually across the world converged on California with one thought in their minds, that somewhere in that mud and rock, there was enough gold to change their lives completely. Most of them were wrong. People died of cholera, of cold, of starvation. Fortunes were spent to get there, and nothing was found to replace them. The gold rush, for the overwhelming majority of the people who participated in it, was not a story of wealth. It was a story of desperation meeting disappointment at the end of a very long road. But there was one man watching all of this from a very specific angle. His name was Samuel Brannan. And Sam Brannan had a piece of information that almost nobody else had yet. He knew about the gold discovery before it became public knowledge. And instead of grabbing a shovel and joining the rush, he did something that requires a particular kind of cold intelligence to even conceive of. He went to every hardware store, every general supply shop, every equipment merchant across California, and he bought everything. Every pickaxe, every shovel, every pan, every sieve, every piece of equipment a gold miner would need to work a claim. He bought it all at normal prices before anyone understood what was coming. Then in May of 1848, he walked into the streets of San Francisco holding a glass bottle filled with gold dust above his head, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River." He didn't find that gold. He bought that bottle specifically to cause a panic. And the panic worked exactly as designed. Within days, the rush accelerated beyond anything California had seen. And every single person who showed up to dig needed equipment. There was only one place to buy it. Sam Brannan had bought shovels for 20 cents and was selling them for $15. In the first 70 days alone, he generated the equivalent of $1.5 million in today's money. By 1849, his store was doing $50,000 a month. He became the wealthiest man in California, not by finding a single grain of gold, but by making himself the only person standing between desperate people and the thing they desperately needed. He never touched a gram of gold. He just controlled the only road that led to it. Now here is where this stops being history and starts being a blueprint for what is happening right now in 2026. Because there is a country running Sam Brannan's play on a scale he could never have imagined. And just like Brannan, this country never touched the thing everyone else is fighting over. It just made itself the only buyer standing between a desperate seller and the rest of the world. That country is China. And the glass bottle it's holding up isn't gold dust, it's Iranian oil. Here is the actual mechanism, because the details matter enormously. Iran right now is economically strangled in a way that has very few historical parallels. American sanctions have been tightening around the Iranian economy for years, and the current conflict has pulled those sanctions into a complete chokehold. The global banking system is largely closed to Iran. Major shipping companies avoid Iranian cargo. The international oil market has effectively shut its doors in Iran's face. The result is that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all Iranian oil exports flow to exactly one destination, a collection of small independent refineries in Shandong province in eastern China, known informally as the teapot refineries, named for their size relative to the massive state-owned energy giants. These refineries became Iran's buyers of last resort because of one specific characteristic: they largely don't hold accounts in American banks, which means Washington's ability to punish them financially is significantly limited compared to the large Chinese state energy companies, which stopped buying Iranian oil around 2018 because they couldn't afford the risk of being cut off from the dollar-based international financial system. The small refineries filled the gap, and in doing so they handed China something that economists have a specific word for. The opposite of a monopoly, where one seller controls a market, is a monopsony. One buyer controls the market. When you are the only customer a seller can reach, you don't negotiate price, you set it. And that is precisely what China has built with Iranian crude oil. In February of 2026, Iranian light crude was trading at discounts of more than $10 per barrel below the global Brent benchmark. But here is where it gets even more interesting, because Iran is not the only desperate seller in this equation. Russia is in almost the same position. Cut off from Western markets, under its own crushing sanctions regime, Russia is also selling the overwhelming majority of its oil to China. Russian Urals crude in February 2026 was trading at discounts of more than $12 below Brent. And both countries, Iran and Russia, are racing against each other to undercut the other's price for the same single customer. When Russia drops its price, China shifts purchases toward Russia. Iran panics and drops further. Russia responds. Iran drops again. China sits in the exact center of this spiral, collecting the difference with the calm patience of someone who knows they are the only game in town. Over 4 years, China saved approximately $12 billion from Russian oil discounts alone. That number doesn't include the Iranian discounts running in parallel. And the brutal logic of the situation is this: every time the conflict escalates, every time another round of sanctions tightens around Tehran, the discount widens. China's energy bill shrinks. The more Iran suffers, the cheaper China's industrial input costs become. And this brings us back to that factory owner in Guangdong. Because this is why his costs dropped. This is the mechanism he couldn't see from where he was standing. The war that has nothing to do with him is subsidizing his survival. But to understand why China needs this subsidy so badly right now, you have to understand a disease that has been eating at the Chinese economy quietly for 3 years. A disease that most Western coverage barely mentions because inflation is the thing everyone is trained to fear. The disease China has is the opposite of inflation. It is deflation. And in many ways it is more dangerous. When prices fall, it sounds like good news. Things get cheaper. Your money goes further. But deflation, when it sets into an entire economy, triggers a death spiral that is extremely difficult to escape. When consumers believe that prices will be lower tomorrow than they are today, they stop buying today. Why would you purchase something now when waiting makes it cheaper? When consumers stop buying, companies lose revenue. When companies lose revenue, they cut workers or shut down entirely. When workers get cut, consumers have even less money to spend. Prices fall further to attract buyers who aren't coming. The cycle feeds itself downward with no natural floor. China entered this spiral and has been trapped inside it for 3 consecutive years. The GDP deflator, the broadest measure of price changes across the entire economy, sat at negative 0.7% in the fourth quarter of 2025. That sounds like a small number until you understand it was the 11th consecutive quarter in negative territory. 11 straight quarters. The longest deflationary streak China has experienced in at least 30 years, stretching back to before the country was even a market economy in the modern sense. The Producer Price Index, which measures what manufacturers charge for their goods, had been negative for 40 consecutive months by January 2026. 40 months. Chinese factories were selling their products for less than they charged the year before, without a single month of relief, for over 3 years straight. Real-world commodity prices were even worse than official figures suggested. Polysilicon, the raw material inside solar panels, one of China's most critical export industries, collapsed to less than 1/5 of its 2022 peak price. Steel rebar hit its lowest level in 8 years. The percentage of Chinese companies operating at a loss reached levels not seen in a quarter century. Now go back to the factory owner in Guangdong and understand what cheap Iranian and Russian oil actually does to his situation. Energy costs drop across every sector simultaneously. Transportation gets cheaper. Plastics, chemicals, synthetic materials, all petroleum derivatives get cheaper. A factory that was selling at a loss suddenly has a margin again. A supply chain that was hemorrhaging cash finds a little room to breathe. The oil discount doesn't cure the deflation, but it stops the bleeding long enough to matter. It buys the Chinese government time to push through structural reforms, time to stimulate domestic consumption, time to engineer an exit from the longest deflationary crisis in its modern history before the clock runs out. And while China is quietly recovering behind this shield of discounted energy, the countries competing with its factories are being destroyed by the same war. Remember BASF, the largest chemical company on Earth, headquartered in Germany. In March 2026, they announced price increases of 30% or more across their European product lines. The official reason stated in their announcement was the dramatic rise in raw material and energy costs driven directly by the Middle East conflict. That is not a business story. That is a signal flare from European industry. The war is breaking their cost structure in real time. Europe pays full market price for energy. Japan pays full market price. South Korea pays full market price. China pays full market price minus $10 to $12 per barrel, delivered through a shadow fleet of tankers sailing under false flags, carrying falsified cargo documents, listing the oil as Omani or Malaysian crude. An entire invisible logistics network has been constructed to move this energy in the dark, outside the reach of Western financial monitoring. And on top of that discounted purchase price, the Chinese government itself absorbs part of any remaining price increase before it reaches Chinese manufacturers and consumers. In March 2026, when market rates dictated a fuel price increase equivalent to 2,205 yuan per ton, Beijing raised prices by only 1,160 yuan and absorbed the rest from state reserves. Two layers of protection that no competitor has. Buy cheap through the back door, then subsidize the remainder from the government's own pocket. Chinese factories enter this economic environment with structurally lower costs than any competitor in the developed world. At the exact moment those competitors are absorbing 30% price shocks. The war in the Middle East is functioning as an industrial policy for China, without China spending a single dollar on the war itself. But here is the section that should genuinely unsettle you. Because the economic gains, as staggering as they are, may not even be the most valuable thing China is extracting from this conflict. In 2025, American and Israeli electronic warfare systems successfully jammed the GPS guidance signals on Iranian ballistic missiles. The logic was straightforward. Iranian missiles were navigating using American GPS satellite signals, and the United States simply disrupted those signals. Missiles lost accuracy. The countermeasure seemed decisive, even elegant, a superpower flipping a switch and neutralizing an adversary's weapons without firing a single shot. Then something changed. Iranian missile systems began transitioning their guidance away from GPS and onto Beidou, China's independent satellite navigation network. What happened next should be read carefully by anyone who thinks about the future of military technology. Accuracy improved dramatically. Beidou's military signal operates through 45 satellites compared to GPS's 24 to 30. But the number of satellites is almost secondary to the architecture of the signal itself. Beidou's military-grade navigation uses frequency hopping technology, meaning the signal constantly shifts frequencies in patterns that jamming systems cannot predict and therefore cannot consistently block. It uses authenticated navigation messages that verify the signal hasn't been spoofed or replaced with false data. The system was designed from the ground up to function in hostile electronic environments where an adversary is actively trying to destroy its usefulness. GPS was designed for navigation in a peaceful world and retrofitted for military application. Beidou was designed for war. The practical result was that Iranian missiles, guided by Beidou, were achieving accuracy below 1 meter. A missile capable of hitting a target the size of a car in the middle of an active jamming environment from hundreds of kilometers away. Now ask the question that matters. What did China receive from this? Every flight path, every frequency jamming pattern the American and Israeli systems deployed, every course correction Beidou's guidance made in response to interference. Every data point generated by months of real combat use against the most sophisticated electronic warfare systems currently deployed by any military on the planet. China did not fire a missile. China did not risk a satellite. China did not spend $1 on the engagement. And yet China's military navigation system just completed the most comprehensive real-world stress test in its history against the best opposition available at zero cost. No simulation produces data like this. No training exercise replicates it. Any other country wanting to test a weapons system under real combat conditions needs to either spend billions on elaborate war games or wait for an actual war to happen and hope to be invited. China was never invited. It just collected the data from a conflict it officially condemned. Meanwhile, America has been burning through inventories it will take years to rebuild. A single American carrier strike group operating in the Gulf costs approximately $6.5 million per day. The advanced precision munitions being expended in this conflict, the specific missiles that defense analysts consider essential to any Taiwan scenario, take, according to multiple estimates from people with access to production timelines, between 20 months and several years to restock. Every launch over the Persian Gulf is a subtraction from the ledger of what's available if the Taiwan Strait heats up. The Center for Strategic and International Studies ran 24 separate wargame scenarios simulating a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. In the majority of scenarios where the United States successfully defended the island, the cost included 500 fighter aircraft, 10 to 20 warships, potentially 2 aircraft carriers, and more than 3,000 American military personnel in the first 3 weeks alone. The United States has 11 aircraft carriers total. Losing 2 in 3 weeks is not a statistic that fits inside normal strategic calculations. It is a civilizational shock. And every high-end missile that doesn't get restocked before that scenario becomes relevant makes the mathematics of those war games worse for Washington. China is not causing this depletion. China is simply watching it happen and understanding what it means. And then there is the horizon beyond the fighting itself, which may be the most valuable prize of all and the one that requires the least effort. History has a pattern here that is almost too consistent to ignore. America fights the wars. China wins what comes after them. In August 2008, while American military personnel were still rotating through Iraq, while the country was still being slowly stitched back together after the invasion that cost over $2 trillion and thousands of American lives, China's state energy company CNPC signed a $3 billion contract to develop one of Iraq's largest oil fields. It was the first major oil deal with a foreign company since the 2003 invasion. The country that opposed the war, that bore none of its costs, that risked nothing in its prosecution, walked in at the moment the dust was settling, and signed the most valuable economic contract the post-war reconstruction produced. This is not a coincidence. It is a repeating pattern that China executes with remarkable consistency. Wait for the chaos. Stay clean of the fighting. Arrive with investment when the smoke clears and the desperate need for reconstruction begins. The country that bled to create the stability pays the reconstruction bill through absence, because it exhausted its resources on the war itself. In May 2025, the first direct freight train departed from Xi'an in China and arrived near Tehran, formally opening a new land corridor connecting China through Central Asia to Iran under the China-Central Asia-West Asia Economic Corridor. The journey that takes 30 to 45 days by sea now takes 15 days by rail. This is infrastructure being threaded into Iranian territory while Iranian cities are still absorbing strikes. It is not humanitarian aid. It is not diplomatic goodwill. It is China prepositioning itself as the indispensable economic partner for whatever Iran becomes when the fighting stops. If the current Iranian government survives, China will be its only functioning economic lifeline with the infrastructure, trade relationships, and financing capacity to anchor a recovery. If the government falls and a new administration emerges, that administration will inherit a country already laced with Chinese railways, Chinese energy agreements, Chinese port deals, and years of Chinese commercial relationships embedded in its economic foundation. Any new government will have to negotiate with a reality that China already built. Beijing understands this. It is not waiting to see how things turn out. It is constructing the outcome regardless of which direction things turn. But now we arrive at the second half of Sam Brannan's story. The half that almost nobody tells, and it is the half that should make Beijing strategists deeply uncomfortable if they are paying attention. Sam Brannan died broke. His wife divorced him in 1870, and the settlement forced him to liquidate nearly everything he had built. He spiraled into alcoholism. He poured what remained of his fortune into failed land deals in Mexico, and spent the final years of his life watching it disappear piece by piece. The year before he died, Mexico paid him $49,000 in outstanding interest on an old debt. He was 69 years old. He traveled back to San Francisco, the city he had essentially conjured into existence through his own manufactured panic, paid every debt he owed to the last cent, and died shortly afterward with nothing left. Not enough to cover a burial. His body sat in a morgue for a full year, 12 months, because not one person came forward to pay for his funeral. The richest man in California, the man who had profited from every single person who ever swung a pickaxe in the gold rush, the architect of the entire San Francisco economy, lay unclaimed in a building nobody visited for a year. He was eventually buried in a small grave with a wooden marker. Nobody came to the funeral. Nobody mourned him publicly. Nobody felt the pull of loyalty or gratitude strong enough to cover the cost of putting him in the ground. He had spent his entire life optimizing transactions. He had never built a relationship. Every person who ever handed him money received something in return and walked away with no feeling of connection to the man they'd bought it from. He won every deal. He lost everything that deals can't buy. Now look at what the countries of the global south are watching in 2026. They are watching China's closest strategic partner of 25 years get systematically dismantled. Iran, a country that signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China in 2021, a country that has been selling its most essential resource to China at steep discounts through years of international isolation, a country that made itself economically dependent on Beijing in ways that left it with almost no alternative, is being taken apart piece by piece. And China's response has been a series of carefully worded statements expressing deep concern and calling for restraint from all parties. Not a weapons shipment, not a diplomatic ultimatum, not a single concrete action that carries any risk whatsoever. A press release. Across Africa, across Southeast Asia, across Latin America, governments that have been deepening economic relationships with China, accepting Belt and Road infrastructure, signing resource agreements, shifting trade toward Chinese markets, gradually drifting away from Western-dominated financial systems, are watching this and filing something away. Not in a diplomatic cable, not in a policy document. In the part of the institutional brain that handles survival calculations. The question forming is not about capability. Everyone understands China is powerful. The question is about willingness. When it matters most, when the cost is real and the risk is genuine, will China show up? NATO has Article 5. Whatever its limitations and internal contradictions, whatever questions surround its credibility in specific scenarios, it represents a legally binding, politically enforced, militarily backed commitment that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Countries inside that framework make security calculations with that guarantee as a real variable. It has teeth. The teeth have been demonstrated. China has no equivalent. There is no Chinese security doctrine that commits Beijing to defend a partner when that defense requires absorbing genuine risk. What China offers is investment and trade, and the kind of diplomatic solidarity that evaporates at exactly the moment it becomes expensive. The nations of the global south are not hearing this from Western analysts. They are watching it play out in real time in Iran and drawing their own conclusions. Some of them are already quietly recalibrating. Not dramatically, not publicly, but the drift is happening. The calculation is shifting. And every month that China issues another measured statement, while its strategic partner absorbs another wave of strikes, the calculation shifts a little further. This is Sam Brannan's second lesson, the one he learned too late. You can be the smartest person in the room. You can read the market perfectly, position yourself flawlessly, profit from every transaction that flows through your hands. You can become the wealthiest, most strategically positioned player in the entire game. And still lose everything that matters, because wealth without loyalty is just a number, and a number can't carry you when the structure collapses. China is, without question, the most disciplined long-term strategic planner operating at the nation-state level in the world today. The gains from this conflict are real. The Beidou combat data is genuinely valuable. The energy discounts are measurably impacting Chinese industrial competitiveness. The infrastructure being laid into Central Asia and Iran represents decades of calculated positioning paying off. The weakening of European and Japanese manufacturing competitors is happening in ways that will compound for years. None of this is trivial, but there is a question that the next decade will answer, and it is the most important geopolitical question of our time. Is China building a world, or is it building a portfolio? Because the difference is everything. A portfolio generates extraordinary returns, but a portfolio has no loyalty. When the manager stops offering the best terms, the assets reallocate. When the manager faces a genuine threat, the assets don't mobilize to help. The portfolio manager sits in a very large room, surrounded by very impressive numbers, and is completely alone. A world, the kind that gets built when a great power accepts real risk on behalf of real partners, creates something that no trade agreement can replicate. It creates the feeling among smaller nations that their survival is connected to something larger than themselves, that someone with real power has a real stake in their continued existence. That relationship is not transactional, it cannot be priced, and it is, ultimately, the only thing that makes power sustainable across generations. Sam Brannan had everything California could offer. He had the most profitable business in the state. He had leverage over every person with ambition and a shovel. He had money that should have lasted 10 lifetimes. He just had no one. And the world's most powerful country in 2026 is in the process of discovering whether the same thing is true of nations, whether you can optimize every transaction, win every deal, collect every discount, and still find yourself standing alone when the moment arrives that actually counts. The story isn't finished. China still has time to write a different ending than Brannan did, but the pages are turning, and the countries watching from the global south are reading every word.